Farm girl in orange. The words didn't fall. They stabbed. Laughter followed like shattered glass scattering across marble floors, bouncing beneath chandeliers that sparkled as if they enjoyed the cruelty. Every head at the gala turned, every smile sharpened, and at the center of it she stood, the woman in the orange gown, tall, poised, her skin glowing against the silk draped across her shoulders. She didn't flinch, she didn't bow, she didn't even blink. Beside her, draped in sequins red as a siren, the billionaire's wife leaned on her husband's arm, laughing loud enough for every tuxedoed guest at the table to hear. "Who let her sit here?" she asked, eyes bright with the kind of amusement that cuts deeper than anger. "This table is for real donors, not," she waved her champagne flute like a dagger, "farm girls dressed for Halloween." The room chuckled with her. Gentlemen in bowdies smirked into their glasses. Women in pearls hid grins behind napkins. It was entertainment to them. A small humiliation served before the main course. But the woman in orange, she only breathed. Steady, silent, her stillness louder than their mockery. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. The insult was aimed at one person, but the sting filled the hall. A young journalist, 2 tables back, froze with his pen midair. A waiter, tray balanced on one hand, stole a glance at the woman's face and felt shame pulse in his chest. Even the orchestra at the far corner hesitated on a note, as if strings themselves sensed the air had turned poisonous. The billionaire's wife pressed on, voice syrupy, words sharpened. "Honestly, who invited her? Look at that gown bright as a pumpkin patch. This is a charity gala, not a costume ball." Her husband laughed along, but not too loud. He knew his wife's cruelty was spectacle. Still, he let it play, because spectacle was what this room fed on. And yet, the orange gown remained aflame. Unmoved, unbowed, she stood as if rooted to the marble itself. If they expected her to shrink, to apologize, to be escorted away, they miscalculated. Badly. Because she wasn't just a guest. She wasn't just a woman in orange. She was the storm they never saw coming. She hadn't stumbled into that ballroom. She chose it. The gala was staged inside a Georgian hall, chandeliers glittering like constellations pinned to the ceiling, tables set with crystal and silver polished to blind. Guests wore money the way others wore, skin unquestioned, unchallenged. And into that theater of privilege she walked, alone, in orange satin that burned brighter than any jewel in the room. No entourage, no designer clutch flaunting labels, no PR team announcing her arrival. She wanted to be unseen, unmeasured, tested, because tests had defined her. At 21, she walked into her first real estate auction wearing a thrift store suit. A man at the back whispered secretary, while another joked mascot. She bought 3 properties before the room finished laughing. At 32, she entered a hotel lobby to negotiate a franchise deal. The manager asked if she was lost, suggested the applicant would arrive shortly. She signed the paperwork while his face drained pale. By 40, her portfolio stretched continents. But still, people looked at her and saw a stranger trespassing in their world. Tonight, it happened again. The orange gown wasn't a mistake. It was a flare. She wanted to see who would notice, who would smirk, who would underestimate her. And the billionaire's wife, with her laugh rehearsed sharper than glass, had delivered exactly on cue. Across the hall, a young journalist scribbled notes furiously. He didn't know her name yet, but something in the way she stood tall, unyielding, silent warned him this story wasn't ending with laughter. A waiter balanced his tray like a shield, refusing to join the chuckles, shame etched into his posture. Even a violinist in the corner let her bow tremble a fraction, the music faltering as if the insult had cracked the air itself. The woman in orange inhaled once, steady. She didn't sit, she didn't move. Every second of her silence pressed heavier against the table than the laughter meant to erase her. She'd been erased before. She wasn't here to let it happen again. What no one at that glittering table knew was that the charity gala itself, the grand stage of their mockery, was funded by a corporation already shifting beneath their feet. A chain worth billions. A chain she now controlled. But not yet. Not here. First, she would let the night breathe. She would let the insult ripple. She would let the arrogance grow fat in the room. Because storms don't shout at the first flash. They wait for the silence before thunder. And she was waiting. It didn't stop with one insult. It never does. The billionaire's wife leaned back in her chair, red gown blazing under the chandelier, her lips curled in a smile meant to wound. She snapped her fingers at a passing attendant, the gesture crisp, dismissive. "Move her," she said, tilting her champagne flute toward the woman in orange. "Take her to the back tables. She doesn't belong here." The words traveled further than she realized. Guests from 3 tables away turned their heads. The waiter froze, tray trembling just enough for ice to clink against glass. His eyes darted between the 2 women, one radiating practiced entitlement, the other holding still like stone. The woman in orange said nothing. Her silence stretched, filling the space the orchestra couldn't. The wife smirked. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just intimidated. Happens when you're in circles too big for you." Her voice dripped like honey, but it stung like acid. A man across the table chuckled into his martini. "Better get her seated somewhere appropriate." A woman beside him whispered, just loud enough to carry, "Look at that dress. Loud colors, no taste. Definitely not old money." The orchestra played on, but softer now. Notes bent under the tension, as if the violins themselves knew they weren't the center of the performance anymore. The young journalist in the back scribbled harder, his pen scratching against the page. Every word sharpened into record. He felt the weight of history in this humiliation. Something told him it wouldn't stay hidden in this ballroom. The waiter still stood frozen, torn between command and conscience. His supervisor caught the hesitation, hissed from across the aisle. "Do it! Move her now! VIP request!" He stepped forward reluctantly, placing his tray aside, and bent low toward the woman in orange. His whisper was almost an apology. "Ma'am, they want you to relocate." She turned her head slowly, her eyes locked on his, calm, steady. She didn't scold him. She didn't plead. She just said one word. "No." The refusal was soft, but it cracked like thunder. The billionaire's wife laughed, sharp and victorious. "You hear that? She thinks she has a choice." She raised her glass higher, voice cutting across the hall. "This gala isn't a charity case for gate crashers." Her husband shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his cufflinks. He wasn't ready to intervene, not yet. Too much money in the room, too much pride in the balance. And so the circle tightened. Guests leaned in, murmurs spreading like smoke. The orchestra faltered again, the music no longer camouflage but fragile background noise. The woman in orange remained seated, unshaken. Silence as shield, stillness as blade. She had been told to move her entire life. Tonight, she wouldn't. The insult had traveled, but her answer had not. She stayed still. No flicker of rage, no raised voice to meet theirs. Just breath steady, unbroken as if she had practiced calm the way others practiced cruelty. The billionaire's wife leaned forward, mistaking silence for surrender. "See? She knows," she said, her laughter spilling across the table like a stain. "She knows she's out of place." Guests around her nodded, eager to agree. That was the rhythm of the room. Follow power, laugh at its jokes, ignore the discomfort that followed. But across the hall, discomfort was no longer silent. A young journalist tapped his pen harder against his notebook, his jaw tightening as he wrote. A waiter adjusted the tray in his hands, eyes refusing to meet the orange gown now glowing brighter beneath the chandelier. Even the orchestra stumbled, a violin string squeaking where it should have soared. Still, she did nothing. And that nothing became unbearable. Because silence in a ballroom of noise is not absence, it is presence. Heavy, undeniable, the kind that bends conversation and forces every mocking word to echo louder than intended. At 23, she had sat in a bank lobby as a teller whispered fraud under her breath. She hadn't shouted then either. She had waited. 2 years later, she acquired that same bank's largest competitor. Silence, she had learned, was a sharper weapon than anger. Now, in the gala, she let it sharpen again. The wife raised her voice higher, filling the pause. "If she were a real donor, we'd all know her name, but we don't, which means," her gaze swept the room, inviting agreement, "which means she doesn't matter." The woman in orange finally moved. Not her lips, not her voice, just her eyes lifting to meet the chandelier above, as though measuring its weight. Then down across the table, toward the flute of champagne still trembling in the wife's hand. Then back to the faces staring, smirking, waiting for her collapse. But collapse never came. She simply placed her hands together, fingers laced, resting them gently on the white linen tablecloth. The gesture was so small, yet it pulled attention tighter than any outburst could. Someone coughed in the corner. Another shifted in their seat. The laughter began to sound rehearsed, forced, as though mocking her required more energy than anyone had left to give. Silence was working, and in that silence, she allowed the room to reveal itself. Who chuckled too quickly? Who looked away in shame? Who scribbled notes? Who dared to keep watching? She didn't need to defend herself. Not yet. The room was already on trial. Silence pressed against the hall like a tide, and in that wait, others began to move. The young journalist, 2 tables back, stopped pretending to eat. He set his fork down, straightened the small leather notebook in front of him, and wrote faster. His pen carved phrases with urgency. Targeted insult, forced relocation, refusal met with mockery. He wasn't sure yet what headline would emerge, but his instinct was clear. Something historic was happening, and history demanded record. At the edge of the ballroom, a server steadied a silver tray against his chest. He had heard insults before they rolled through events like background music, but this one tasted different. Maybe it was the brightness of the orange gown against all that black and white. Maybe it was the way the woman wore silence, not shame. Either way, his pulse quickened. He wanted to step closer, to shield, to speak. But staff were trained to be invisible, and so he did what he could. He watched. 2 guests at a neighboring table whispered. A man in a navy tux leaned to his wife. That was unnecessary. She frowned, scanning the faces around them. Unnecessary, yes, but no one will say it. Another voice cut the air, a young woman seated near the back. No pearls, no diamonds, just a rented dress and restless eyes. She muttered, not loud but enough for her table to hear. This isn't right. Heads turned toward her, then away again, as if agreement could stain reputation. Even the music betrayed unease. A violin faltered mid-note, recovered, faltered again. The conductor's hand twitched impatiently, but the crack had already slipped through. Art itself was refusing to mask the cruelty. And still, the woman in orange gave them nothing. No plea, no protest, only presence. That presence unsettled more than insults ever could. The billionaire's wife laughed louder, straining now. Her performance demanded applause, but instead it met scattered coughs, shifting chairs, the scrape of silverware stalling against china. The journalist lifted his eyes from the page and studied the orange gown again. There was composure there, yes, but also calculation. This wasn't just endurance, it was strategy. He underlined a word in his notebook. Waiting. The waiter edged closer, offering champagne to the guests beside her, but never to her. His throat tightened. If he poured, he would become part of the insult. If he didn't, he risked his job. He held the bottle mid-air until sweat pooled at his temple. Finally, he stepped back. The decision to withhold service recorded not just in her memory, but in the eyes of half the room. From the far corner, a photographer raised her camera, hesitated, then lowered it. No flash. Not yet. She wanted the moment, but the moment was still building. That was the truth of the gala now. A room designed for spectacle had become a stage for witness. Every cough, every scribble, every skipped note was testimony. And the woman in orange, silent, unyielding, let it all accumulate. The laughter returned, harsher this time, desperate to fill the silence that had grown too heavy. The billionaire's wife leaned in, eyes glittering with cruel delight. She tapped her glass with a manicured nail, ping, 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 drawing even more attention. Honestly, she said, voice pitched for the entire hall. Who invited her? Look at that dress. Orange satin? This is a charity gala, not a county fair. The table erupted. A few guests slapped palms against polished mahogany. Others hid grins behind napkins. The cruelty was no longer private, it was a performance, and the audience, hungry, played along. Her husband shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, but offered no interruption. He had built his empire by avoiding conflict, by letting arrogance run its course. Tonight, he would do the same until it was too late. The woman in orange sat poised, her chin lifted just slightly, eyes steady. She didn't rise to their bait. She let their laughter ring, let it echo, let it condemn them without her help. The journalist scribbled harder, pen cutting grooves into the page. His notes grew sharper. Mockery escalates. Public humiliation. Targeted cruelty becomes spectacle. He didn't need quotes anymore. The room itself was testimony. The orchestra faltered again. A violin squealed. A trumpet stumbled. The music that once gilded the evening now betrayed it, refusing to cloak the ugliness unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Across the hall, a young guest whispered, "This is wrong," louder this time. Her companion hushed her, terrified of attention, but the words hung anyway, uninvited, undeniable. The billionaire's wife raised her flute higher. "Here's the truth," she sneered. "If she were truly a donor, we'd know her name, but we don't, which means she doesn't belong. Not at this table, not in this room." She let the words hang, then tipped her glass, spilling 2 deliberate drops of champagne across the orange gown. "Oh," she said with mock innocence, "guess that's what farm fabric attracts." Gasps rippled, small but audible. Some guests looked down at their plates, ashamed. Others laughed louder, overcompensating for the discomfort. The woman in orange dabbed at her gown once. Calm, precise. No anger, no outrage. Just composure, measured and sharp. At 26, she had once stood outside a hotel conference room, badge in hand, while security blocked her path, convinced she was staff, not speaker. She had waited in silence then, too, until the director personally came to escort her in. She remembered that stillness now, the discipline of letting others choke on their own arrogance. And so, here in the gala, she waited again. The journalist circled one word in his notes: humiliation. Then he wrote another beneath it: miscalculation. Because cruelty always overplays its hand, and when it does, the reckoning is never far behind. The spill of champagne should have been enough, but arrogance never knows when to stop. The billionaire's wife leaned back in her chair, eyes flashing like stage lights, savoring the hush that followed her cruelty. Then, with a deliberate flick of her wrist, she set her flute down and raised her hand toward the entry doors. "Security!" Her voice cracked across the hall like a gavel. "Escort her out, now." Gasps fluttered through the tables. Forks froze mid-air. Knives hovered above untouched lamb. For a heartbeat, even the orchestra fell silent. The word hung heavy: escort. 2 uniformed guards at the far edge of the ballroom stiffened. They hesitated, unsure, eyes flicking between the red-draped wife and the woman in orange who still sat unmoved. The guards had been trained to protect donors, not humiliate them. And yet, the command was public. It demanded a response. The journalist's pen nearly tore through the paper, called "Security on Guest, Public Expulsion Attempt." He underlined it twice, his pulse hammering. The young woman at the back whispered again, louder now, "This is insane." Her companion shushed her, but this time heads turned toward her, catching the spark of dissent. The wife mistook it for validation. "You heard me," she said, her words sharp enough to cut crystal. "She doesn't belong here. She's a fraud parading in satin. Remove her." One guard stepped forward, boots heavy on marble, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats. Some looked away, ashamed. Others watched hungrily, as if cruelty were theater. But the woman in orange did not move. Her hands remained laced on the linen, her gaze steady, her breathing calm. She sat as though anchored, as though the marble itself refused to let her go. At 28, she had once been stopped in an airport lounge, accused of forging her own boarding pass. She hadn't argued then, either. She had waited until her name flashed across the shareholder registry of the airline itself. Security apologized. She never forgot the look in their eyes, fear disguised as respect. She saw that same hesitation now in the guards. Still, they advanced. The orchestra's bowstrings screeched, one final discordant note before the conductor threw up his hands in defeat. The music died, leaving only the sound of footsteps and a room holding its breath. The wife smiled, triumphant, convinced victory was seconds away. "Out," she hissed. "Take her out of my sight." But triumph built on arrogance is fragile. The woman in orange lifted her chin, eyes steady as steel, and whispered, not loud, not frantic, just clear enough to carry to the guards, "Touch me once, and this gala ends tonight." The words cut through the silence like a blade. The guards froze. The crowd inhaled as one. And the journalist wrote one final word at the bottom of his page: reckoning. The hall held its breath. Guards stood locked in place, the command caught between obedience and doubt. The billionaire's wife drummed her nails against the tablecloth, furious at the pause. "What are you waiting for?" she snapped. "Remove her." But the woman in orange was already moving, not rising, not resisting. Just one slow, deliberate gesture. She reached for the phone resting beside her plate. The sleek black screen lit against her fingertips. No rush, no panic. A queen touching her scepter. She pressed a single button. Across the room, the journalist leaned forward, straining to catch her words. The waiter stopped pretending to serve. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum, as if glass itself leaned down to listen. Her voice was calm, measured. "Initiate the protocol." There was silence on the other end for half a breath. Then a crisp female voice replied, audible to those closest. "Confirmed. Full acquisition mode engaged." The billionaire's wife blinked, confused, her smirk faltering. "What nonsense is that? Acquisition mode?" She laughed too loud, desperate to recover her stage. "She's bluffing, calling imaginary assistance in front of everyone." But the phone remained live, and the voice on the line did not waver. "Legal board notified. Audit teams alerted. Contracts flagged. Estimated timeline, 90 minutes to complete." The journalist's pen flew. Protocol. Legal board. Contracts flagged. His heart raced. This wasn't theater. This was business real, sharp, and very dangerous. The guards took a step back, unsure now whom they served. The tension in their shoulders softened, replaced with caution. One murmured to the other, "Wait, let's see where this goes." Guests shifted in their seats, murmurs threading the air. "What's she talking about?" one whispered. "Audit teams?" another asked. A third frowned, staring at the woman in orange as if trying to remember a face from the news. The billionaire's wife slammed her palm on the table. "This is a joke. Call her bluff. She doesn't belong here." But the woman in orange didn't look at her. She spoke into the phone again, steady, unbothered. "Escalate if resistance continues. Document every word, every laugh, every witness." "Logged," the assistant's voice replied. "Building record in real time." The hall vibrated with unease. The orchestra, instruments lowered, stared openly now. Guests whispered, half afraid, half enthralled. Something irreversible had begun, and everyone knew it. The woman in orange finally lifted her gaze to the guards, her tone unshaken. "You wanted me removed. Instead, I've just removed the first stone from your empire." And with that, the balance shifted. The billionaire's wife laughed again, but it sounded thinner now, brittle as glass on the edge of breaking. "Listen to her," she sneered. "Talking about boards and audits. She's delusional. A trespasser in satin pretending to matter." But the room wasn't laughing anymore. The murmurs had shifted. Questions pulsed through the tables like electricity. Audit teams, protocols, acquisition. Faces turned, some curious, some worried. Even the orchestra lowered their instruments completely, silence surrendering to the moment. The woman in orange rose at last, slowly, deliberately. Her chair scraped against marble like a verdict being written. Every eye followed her, unwilling, unable to look away. She placed her phone on the table, still glowing, still alive with the assistant's voice in the background. Then she spoke, not loud, not hurried. Her words fell steady, certain. "You want to know my name?" The wife smirked. "Yes, so we can blacklist it." The woman in orange let the pause stretch until even the chandeliers seemed to tremble with anticipation. Then, "My name is Alexandra Pierce." A ripple coursed through the room. Heads turned, gasps burst, small but sharp. Someone whispered, "Pierce Holdings?" Another muttered, "No, it can't be." She continued, calm as steel. "I am the majority shareholder of the Pierce Foundation, the very foundation underwriting tonight's gala, the very one your husband's chain depends on for survival." The husband stiffened, his face drained, his cufflinks glinting like shackles. He had heard her name before, whispered in boardrooms, printed in trade reports, spoken with caution by men who prided themselves on never fearing anyone. And yet here she stood in satin orange, dismissed as a trespasser minutes ago, revealing the truth in front of hundreds. The journalist's pen nearly ripped the page. "Majority shareholder. Chain depends on her." His hands shook with the magnitude of it. The wife froze, her smirk evaporating. Her mouth opened, then closed, but no words came. The room had flipped in an instant. Her stage of cruelty stolen, her spotlight seized. Alexandra's eyes swept the hall, calm and unyielding. "You said I didn't belong here, but this hall, this gala, this chain your family flaunts, every inch of it is mine to decide. And tonight, I've decided one thing clearly: dignity is not optional." It is the foundation you forgot to build. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thunder held in the chest of every witness. Guests who had laughed minutes earlier now sat stiff, ashamed. The young journalist trembled, realizing the headline would write itself. The billionaire's wife whispered, almost pleading now, "No, this can't," but it already had. The silence broke not with laughter, but with gasps. Dozens of them, scattered like sparks across the hall. At the center table, the billionaire's wife sat frozen, her red gown suddenly garish under the chandeliers. Her hand still clutched the stem of her flute, trembling, champagne rippling inside like liquid panic. The smirk that had once ruled the room was gone, stripped bare in front of every eye. Her husband fared no better. Color drained from his face until he looked more ghost than man. He fumbled with his cufflinks, as if loosening them might loosen the noose tightening around his empire. His jaw flexed, but no defense came. He knew the name Alexandra Pierce. Every investor did. She wasn't a guest. She was a verdict. Around them, guests shifted uneasily. A woman in pearls whispered to her partner, "She funds the gala. She funds all of it." Another man set down his glass, muttering, "How did we not recognize her?" The bravado of moments before melted into shame, unease, fear. The guards who had advanced now stepped back quickly, shoulders stiff, eyes downcast. They had nearly touched her, nearly humiliated the very woman who held the strings of their paychecks through contracts signed beyond their understanding. One rubbed his temple, pale with the realization of what almost was. The journalist at the back pressed his pen hard against the page until ink bled. He looked up, eyes wide, breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was history unspooling live in satin and silence. He flipped his notebook shut, reached for his phone, and hit record. Words weren't enough now. The world would need to see. A ripple of movement spread through the room. Phones lifted discreetly at first, then openly. Guests who had laughed earlier now filmed, desperate to capture their own redemption as witnesses rather than accomplices. The chandeliers reflected dozens of tiny screens, each recording the moment arrogance shattered. The orchestra sat idle, instruments abandoned. A violinist leaned her chin into her palm, stunned. The conductor lowered his baton entirely, his eyes fixed on the woman in orange who had turned a gala into a tribunal. The billionaire's wife finally spoke, her voice small, strangled. "She's lying." But no one echoed her this time. Not one. The hall was done applauding cruelty. Alexandra Pierce stood in the eye of it all, untouched, her silence more commanding than any rebuttal. She hadn't needed to shout. She had simply revealed the truth, and the truth had done the rest. The guests felt it. The staff felt it. Even the husband, pale and broken, felt it. The empire had cracked, and everyone in the room had just watched the first fault line split wide open. Alexandra didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The hall leaned forward to catch every word, as if truth itself had become fragile crystal. She rested one hand lightly on the phone still glowing on the table. "Carla," she said evenly, "initiate the final directive." A woman's voice answered crisply through the speaker. "Confirmed. Termination protocol ready. Awaiting your word." The billionaire's wife flinched at the word termination. Her husband's hand shot out, clutching her wrist as if silence might still save them. But Alexandra was already moving. She stepped into the center of the room, her orange gown blazing against the black and white sea of tuxedos. Her presence anchored the space, every eye tethered to her. "This gala," she began, "was built on the promise of dignity, of charity, of humanity. And yet, in this very room, I was told I did not belong." Her gaze swept the tables, pausing on the wife who had mocked her, the husband who had stayed silent. "You called me unworthy at a table I funded. You laughed while your empire rested on my signature." Gasps echoed again. Some guests dropped their eyes, ashamed. Others clutched their phones tighter, recording what they knew would go viral before the night ended. Alexandra turned slightly toward the phone. "Effective immediately," she said. "Pierce Holdings withdraws all sponsorship from this event. Every contract tied to this chain frozen. Every dollar recalled. Every partnership terminated." "Logged," Carla replied. "System. Wide freeze already in motion. Assets locked. Notifications delivered to board members as of now." The husband slumped in his chair, pale as parchment. The wife shook her head wildly. "You can't. You wouldn't." Alexandra's eyes cut through her. "I already did." The orchestra gasped. The journalist's phone shook in his hand, the red recording light blinking like a beacon. Guests whispered frantically. She killed the chain. 3.2 billion gone. Just like that. The guards who had once stepped toward her now stood rooted, horrified at their near mistake. One whispered to the other, "She owns all of it." Alexandra clasped her hands behind her back, her voice calm, final. "You tried to reduce me to fabric and color, but I am the ledger that determines whether your doors stay open tomorrow." The wife's face crumbled. Her laugh was gone, her defiance drowned in the silence of a hall that had just witnessed the collapse of arrogance. Alexandra turned to the crowd, her final words precise, surgical. "Tonight I didn't lose a place at your table. You lost the table itself." The chandeliers shivered as if the room itself understood. Judgment had been passed. The hall was no longer a gala. It was a courtroom, and Alexandra Pierce had just rendered judgment. The billionaire's wife sat crumpled in her chair, her once perfect smile shattered, red gown now a costume of defeat. Her husband stared at the tablecloth, cufflinks glinting like cold chains, his empire unraveling in front of his eyes. Around them, guests whispered in shock, some filming openly now, others too ashamed to meet Alexandra's gaze. She didn't look at the wife again. She didn't need to. Cruelty had already sentenced itself. Alexandra stepped back to her chair, lifted the phone once more, and spoke with calm finality. "Carla, confirm closure." "Confirmed," the assistant's voice replied. "All holdings transferred. Their chain is frozen. Notifications sent to every board member. Effective immediately, the Pierce Foundation assumes full control." The words carried like a storm rolling through marble corridors. Every guest heard them. Every guest felt the weight of them. The empire worth $3.2 billion had been crushed in seconds, not with shouts, not with spectacle, but with quiet authority. Alexandra closed her phone, the glow disappearing into black glass. Then she turned to the room, her voice steady, deliberate. "You thought dignity was a costume, something you could spill champagne on, laugh at, dismiss. But dignity is not given by your approval. It is not measured by fabric or seating charts. Dignity is decided by truth, by power, by presence, and tonight, it decided against you." The journalist's pen scratched one last line before his hand froze. Dignity doesn't beg, it decides. He knew it was the headline. He knew it was history. The waiter at the edge of the hall straightened his shoulders, a flicker of pride in his chest. The young woman in the rented dress whispered, "Yes," under her breath, as though the verdict had been hers too. Even the orchestra sat taller, instruments resting in silence, acknowledging the gravity of what they had witnessed. Alexandra let her gaze sweep the hall one last time. "I don't need to record this moment," she said, her words cutting through the chandelier's glow. "I am the record. I am the result. Remember that the next time you mistake silence for weakness..." She gathered her clutch, simple, elegant, unbranded, and turned toward the doors. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path. Phones followed her steps, lenses trembling to capture the image of a woman who had dismantled arrogance without raising her voice. At the threshold, she paused. Just once. Her final words dropped like a gavel. "You mocked a dress. I erased an empire. Dignity doesn't shout. It decides." And with that, Alexandra Pierce left the hall not as a guest expelled, but as the storm that had rewritten the night.